Today's 200th episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn. Dunn is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn develops community engagement and organising strategies to win campaigns, both big and small, and we train engagement staff, organisers and volunteers in leadership and power building, and we help leaders craft their own public narrative that tells a story that unites people and moves them to act together. And if you want to create change in your community in 2023, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. When you need support with a legal issue, it can feel really daunting, and that's why for over 100 years, Maurice Blackburn has been helping guide clients with their legal needs. They're here to help when you need them the most, from workplace to medical injuries, class actions, occupational diseases, and wills and estates planning. As Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, they have the local knowledge and the national network with the experience that you can count on. And to find out more, just go to their website, which is mauriceblackburn.com.au. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community both online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners, and to find out more, go to their website at swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Hello and welcome to this special episode of Socially Democratic. 200 episodes, who would have thought, of your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast. It's out every Friday that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And on this special occasion, to mark this special episode, we have invited four of our favourite guests who have been on the show many, many times over the last 2.5 years or however long we've been doing this, to have a quick chat about what's going on in their world. So it's a bit of a speed dating kind of speed round of podcast episode interviews. So looking forward to talking to a whole bunch of really cool, fun, engaging and wonderful people that have been great supporters of our show since we began way back in May, I think it was, or April 1999. So we hope you enjoy today's episode. And just as I want to say to all of our dedicated listeners who have been with us either since day one or have just started listening to the show in the last couple of weeks, we thank you for your support in making this podcast the success that it is. Getting to 200 episodes isn't an easy thing. And we want to thank our audience. We also want to thank all of our guests that have come on the show over the years, and also want to thank our producer, Rebecca Connell, who does all of the legwork behind the scenes for me to then rock up each week and then just basically interview someone, which I love doing, hearing people's stories, their challenges, their successes, their lessons that they learned from it, things that motivate them, things that inspire them. Interviewing is such a wonderful opportunity to get into the insights of people that make them tick and what motivates them. But in order for that to happen, it actually takes a lot of work. And Rebecca, our wonderful producer, does all of the research, books all the guests, edits the podcast, publishes the podcast, does all the social media, the whole thing, everything. That's down to her skills as a great producer. So thank you, Rebecca, for your talents as well. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast and leave us a review. We love the reviews. Good positive reviews are always a good thing for the show. You can do that on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And for all the updates, of course, make sure you follow Dunn on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to our 200th episode. We are taping this one on a Tuesday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people on a very, what I would call a typical cold winter's day here. It's definitely now black coat and thick scarf season in Melbourne. And this is our 200th episode. As I said in the opening bit that I don't think anyone listens to because they skip over it because of the ads. But it is our 200th episode. So we thought we would celebrate that by having some of our favourite guests on the show and Josh Burns.
I was going to say, none of them were available, so you got stuck with me.
Well, I like the symbolism, Josh, because you were our first guest. You bought the Social Democratic stocks early.
I bought Bitcoin when it was only a few cents, and look at what you've become. You've flourished into this incredible juggernaut. And for everyone listening at home, the tables are going to turn today for this 200th episode, Stephen. I thought, you're usually the host. You welcome people onto your show. It's time to turn this around, and I thought we'd ask you some questions. So you better be prepared to be spearsed like an interview by David Spiers, because I'm bringing some hard-hitting questions to you right now. Are you ready for a bit of a interviewing Stephen on the 200th episode of Socially Democratic?
Well, the answer is no, I'm most certainly not.
Absolutely not. Cut.
Yeah. Before you do do this and begin your very last episode ever on the show, I need to introduce who you are. It's Josh Burns. The first time you're on the show, you were a candidate for the Labor Party, running in the seat of Macnamara, the federal seat of Melbourne's inner south-east. And obviously now I'd like to welcome Josh Burns, the member for Macnamara, 2 elections back-to-back, going for a three-peat in a couple of years' time, to the show. Welcome back,
Josh. To baseball.
Welcome back to Social Democratic.
For anyone who didn't get it, that was a Michael Jordan joke. Yeah, brilliant.
Jordan Rides the Bus, an excellent 30 for 30 documentary if you're ever interested. Anyway, I'm delaying here to avoid the questions.
Yeah, cut it out. All right, here we go. Stephen, this now is about you, because you've brought so many brilliant conversations via the Socially Democratic podcast. I thought we'd go behind the man behind the podcast and ask some questions about you. So we're going to do this in 3 bits. The first one's about Stephen. The second one is about the podcast. And then the third one, we've got a quick fire rapid round about all of the different bits that you and I have in common, mainly some basketball and food enthusiasm for various bits. Anyway, let's see how it goes. And first of all, as someone who's now done 200 podcasts, you've been a former union organiser. Is that right?
Correct.
You've been an assistant secretary of the Labor Party. You've been a political activist and in the organising space for a long time. What was the moment that you knew you were going to be a political organiser?
Okay, rightio. So you definitely are turning the tables on me. This is my favourite question. Well, obviously there are lots of moments, aren't there, in this journey that we all have where we answer calls to leadership. The moment that I knew I was going to be an organiser is a funny moment in some senses, because when I went for my very first job at a trade union, I got offered 2 roles, to be either a union organiser, or to be I think the role was called a research officer. So it was sort of paralegal, assisting the industrial officers kind of thing. And I was in my early 20s, and I foolishly thought that I would be better as a research officer than an organiser. I didn't think I'd be cut out for organising. And so I said, I think I'll be a research officer. And 12 months into the job, the secretary of the union calls me in and says, "Stephen, you're not very good at this, are you?" And I was like, "No, actually, I'm terrible. I'm really, really bad at this, in fact." And they said, "Well, why don't I think you should have a crack at being a organiser." And it wasn't a case of, here's another opportunity. It's kind of like, here's your last opportunity, really. So, it's either being an organiser or there's the door. So in some ways, it was a lack of self-belief that I had at the time. I had to find the courage to say, yes, I can do this if I wanted to remain gainfully employed. Luckily for me and for the union, I took to organising like a duck to water, and I enjoyed talking to people and going out. And the initial fear you have about, going into a work site and not knowing anyone and trying to break the ice, which we all hate. Like me at a party, first 10 minutes, I hate being at a party because I'm looking around, I'm scanning the room, and I'm looking for strong ties. I'm not looking for weak ties,
Yeah.
And bed from there. Anyway, so I guess in that meeting with the secretary was when the idea was forced upon me. But I guess when I really I'm trying to think of the time when I first thought, I can do this.
You must have felt satisfying. Being able to, through effort, make a difference.
Oh, without a doubt. The first time I really felt like I was actually organising others was actually when I was an organiser for the Transport Workers Union in South Australia, and I was looking after the call centre, which sounds strange given why it's the TWU organising call centres. I'm not even going to go into the demarcation reasons why that led to that be the case, but let's just deal with it. I was organising the Origin Energy Call Centre on King William Street in Adelaide. And there's a lot of workers there. There was over 500-600 workers across multiple floors, but there was only one delegate on each floor. And I set about trying to find activists to take on leadership roles across all of those floors and train and develop them to be me when I'm not there, basically. And I remember we had like a Christmas sort of lunch for all the delegates and with my boss, and they all rocked up. I ended up moving from 4 delegates to, I think we end up having 12 or 13 delegates, and they all rocked up to lunch, and they brought with them all of the membership cards of all the new members they'd signed up over the last week, of which there was a stack this thick. And I just handed them to my boss and said, there you go. And at that moment I went, yeah, I'm organised. Well, they're organised. I don't even need to be there. They're doing the work with those members, and they're organising and they're building power in their own way, but they're doing it in a collective way. And that moment there, I sort of dawned on. There was a great pride that I handed that wad full of cards over to the late Senator Alex Gallagher. God rest his soul. But it was that moment of handing it over to him going, there you go, Alex. This group is organised.
What a good feeling. And then that led you on to this sort of really successful career. You've had such a big influence on both state and federal elections. What's been a memory from an election that really has sat with you where you felt like politics is an amazing vehicle? What's been something from an election that you would just recall?
Oh, that's a very good question, but a difficult one. I mean, there are fun moments on campaigns, right? That you remember, like the can rallies that we had, and seeing almost 1,000 people come together in a big auditorium and just cheer on volunteers getting up and sharing their stories and stuff. But I'm just trying to think of something a bit more.
I remember one line from the 2014 can rally when Daniel Andrews first got on stage in Victoria, and everyone was going crazy. It was this great auditorium in Melbourne. And Daniel Andrews said, how many people does it take to win an election? And he goes, about this many, I reckon, about this many. And I thought that was a great way of empowering the room to be a part of history and to be a part of change. And there are moments like that where you bring all of these volunteers together. And I think that was a good one. That was, obviously you were such a big part of that 2014 campaign to get rid of a first-term Liberal government.
I think I do. I fondly remember that. I must admit, if you talk to any of the organisers that were involved in organising those can rallies, every time I walk past that Deakin Edge Theatre in Fed Square, I still get PTSD because we were always shitting ourselves. Can we fill it? There's nothing worse than hiring a big auditorium and then not being able to, get 700-800 people or whatever it holds to fill it. But we always managed to do it. One memory actually I do have, which was from the 2018 campaign. Very, very late. It might have been the Thursday night before election day. And one of our field organisers, the field organiser for, I won't name her because I don't want to embarrass her, but one of the outer eastern suburban races. And I know that throughout the year she struggled with the idea of being an organiser. And had similar challenges that I had when I was back at the union, lack of belief in their own skills and ability. But she had a very good regional field director that was always pumping her tyres and developing her and training her and ensuring that her skills as an organiser grow over time. But we went, Daniel, the bus, the bus that Daniel would kick around in the final couple of weeks of the campaign. On the Thursday night, the bus went to 4 or 5 local campaigns and dropped off some big care baskets, just sort of, like big baskets with chocolates and bottle of champagne or wine or whatever and goodies and that kind of stuff. And then they give to the volunteers. And we rocked up to this particular campaign, and Daniel gets off the bus, and there was a phone bank going on inside, and a door knock shift had just ended. And Daniel gets swamped by easily 40, 50 people. And the diversity of those people, this is a very multicultural part of outer eastern Melbourne. And I just stood back and looked at all of these people just hanging around Daniel going, this is great. We're so fired up. And Daniel gives them a bit of a speech about this is all about you and you are the people that make the difference in this campaign. But off to the side was the organiser. And I just wandered up sidled up beside her and I said, you built this. This is your work. She started to tear up and I started to tear up and going, oh my God, I wasn't doing this to get emotional here, but I just wanted to tell you, look, you should be proud of what you've achieved over the last 10 months. This work is not easy. Not everyone wants to be an organiser. And there were probably moments where you doubted your own ability over the course of this journey, but check this out. This is just a moment in this campaign, but you built this and you should be so proud of that. And we won that seat. That was a seat we had to win off the Tories. And so that moments like that, which happen a lot, you need to stop and reflect on those every now and then and go, the work that we do in organising is not transactional, it's transformational. And remembering those moments are so important to the movement, really.
Absolutely. What a great story. Let's take it to the podcast, because you've done 200 episodes, which is, like already longer than more episodes than Rick and Morty and a few other really high valued shows. So you're obviously really you've
the OC.
Yeah, the OC. I'm on Ted Lasso, but I reckon that's still got some legs in it. Anyway, I digress. What do you think has been some of the key themes that have come out of all your guests about, if you could, you're the one that's been in all of these conversations. What do you think some of the key messages that people try and impart on through the conversations you've had on the podcast?
I think the thing that I take from all of the guests that we've had, first of all, a willingness to come on to the show, particularly in the early days, right? Like when we first started this was a grassrootsy, podcast. I'm not a media person. I don't have a profile. Why would you want to come and talk to Stephen Donnelly, right? And so that's why I'm always eternally grateful for you, Josh, for coming on day one.
I think I had some of your whiskey in exchange. I can't remember, and may have had a nap on your couch before going home. I can't remember, but it was probably out of the goodness of my heart. That was
it was great solidarity showing there, and I do appreciate that. Never forget that. And yet you do continue to come on the show subsequently.
I like it. Yeah, it's great. It's good. It's a good show.
But I guess what I do appreciate from all of our guests is, first of all, their vulnerability in talking about the issues that are important to them. And I think that's really, really important. And that when that comes through, there is an authenticity to the conversation that I hope our audience enjoys. The second thing I take from a lot of the conversations we've had is that it's an education. And I'm always the first to, I always say this at the start of any episode where we're talking about something that I know nothing about. I always say, hey, I don't know anything about this particular issue. Like, I'm not a policy person by any stretch of the imagination, So whenever I do have people on here that are far learned on a certain topic than I am, I'm on a journey to learn things. But I hope that's certainly what we're trying to do with our guests, is for them to impart knowledge to our audience. And so I think that's an underlying factor that's always important for when we have people on the show. But also also growth, seeing growth, both from successes in the work that they do, but also the challenges that they face. Because success isn't a straight line. Like we zig and zag all the time. But we have to learn from all the different challenges and the successes. So I get a lot of energy out of that, talking to people saying, well, what did fuck up, and how did you come back from that, right? How did you readjust? How did you, how did you change your strategy? But also, how did you have success? What was that grounded in? So I think they're the things that I enjoy the most out of the conversations that we've had across the 200 episodes. And by and large, I think most of our guests tend to nail that. And if they don't, our listeners tend to let us know via the various platforms.
Free and frank advice. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And I love it.
Yeah.
I want more of that. I always say to people, no, people ask, Stephen, love the show. Yeah, good. What's not good about it? Tell me what you don't like. That's what I want to know, because that's how we can improve it. But people are too nice sometimes.
They are. I do think it is good listening, though. Tell me something. So before we get onto a sort of quick fire round of quick fireness, Stephen, you've interviewed a lot of people inside Australia and outside Australia. What do you think is the sort of big challenges on the horizon for social democrats, both in Australia but also internationally? I mean, what do you see as the sort of 6, 12, 5-year challenges that we've got ahead of us in order to maintain our ability to help create positive change in society?
Oh, man. I think that there are differences and similarities between social democratic parties around the globe, including our wonderful, great Australian Labor Party. I think there are some things, and we talked about this with Claire Ainsley, who was on the show episode 198 or something, 2 or 3 episodes ago. And we specifically talked about this topic, and I found that conversation with her quite enlightening. I think there are some things that the Labor Party in Australia does well. I think that our party and our membership and our leadership is far more connected to the constituency and understands the challenges that the constituency is going through and knows how to communicate a message and policies that inspire that constituency to give them support at the ballot box. And I think a lot of it is through the frame of jobs and job creation and investment in innovation and that kind of stuff. And we kind of talked about that in the show. I think that there is a disconnect in social democratic parties overseas. I think that's where they struggle.
Right.
Now, where I think that here at home we can improve, I think we can improve actually in broadening our activist base. I think that the party needs more members, or we need to start to review what a member looks like. Because some people just aren't joiners, but they want to participate. One thing we learned from the Community Action Network or the Field Program in Victoria, 65% of the people who make calls, knock doors, are not members of the Labor Party. So there's a lot of people who want to support good people like you, but don't want to join the Labor Party. And I think that's fine if that's how they want to do it. So we're going to work out how that relationship works. And by building that pipeline, then we're going to find better candidates. And we find better candidates that we can put into public office at a federal, state, local government level. Then we have better people representing the constituency, and therefore we'll be more electorally successful. They're the things that I think we need to focus on in the next 6 years.
I think we're running out of time, so let's move on to some quick fire, rapid questions. You can't dwell, you can't sit there and twiddle your thumbs. You've got to come back to me straight away. It's sort of your one-word answer, whatever comes to mind. We're gonna get the essence of Stephen Donnelly through these rapid fire questions. All right,
this is
pure instinct. That's what I want.
Okay.
We're going to start the clock.
Far away.
Who is your social democratic hero?
Paul Keating.
What is the best restaurant you like to go to talk shop?
Hazel.
I was there the other day. Good restaurant. All right, I'm going to go through each position, and you're going to say the best NBA player for that position of all time. Are we ready?
Oh.
Point guard.
I'm going to say Rajon Rondo.
Jesus, that's a terrible answer. Shooting guard.
Larry Bird.
That is another terrible answer.
No, Michael Jordan.
Thank you. A small forward.
Ray Allen.
Wow. Power forward.
Was Magic a power forward?
Magic was a point guard.
Oh, he was too, wasn't he?
Yeah. You picked Rajon Rondo.
I know I did.
For anyone who doesn't listen to watch basketball, that was a terrible, terrible answer. But you can go Magic can play at the 4 in your weird, wacky.
No. Larry Bird.
Bird. Great. Center, big man.
It has to be Shaq, right?
You'd think so. All right.
Too many Lakers in that list.
And Celtics. you got 5 minutes to have a conversation with one social democrat of history. Who is it going to be and why? 10 seconds or less.
It would be. Oh shit. It would be Barack Obama. I'd like to have. I mean,
He's great.
what? I don't have to say anything else. Barack Obama.
Barack Obama. Who is secretly the funniest person in politics?
I actually think David Feeney is the funniest person in politics, but you're a close second, Josh.
Don't tell Feeney that I agree. Who is the most surprising politician that you've met?
Surprising.
Yeah. Who surprised you?
I actually think Daniel Andrews surprised me.
I think he surprised a lot of people. 2 last questions. Quick fire. How long have you been a member of the Australian Labor Party?
I joined in October 1993.
Wow. So we're now on 30 years in a couple of months. Wow. You'll be getting your life membership in 10 years. And the last question, Stephen Donnelly, how many more episodes of Socially Democratic can we expect on the horizon?
Well, if people keep on listening, then we'll keep on making episodes. So it's an infinity. It just keeps going until I die.
I thank you, Stephen, for your candid answers, and thank you also for bringing really interesting and good conversations via the podcast. I do hope you keep going, and it was my honour to be the first guest of it, and I hope to come back again as sometime in the future.
Joshua, you are always welcome on the show. Thank you so much. Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations and events that will energize the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show. All right, so it's our 200th episode, and we thought it'd be a good idea to get some of our favourite guests that we've had over the years on the podcast to come and celebrate our 200th episode, and all of them declined, so we thought we'd settle to start with David Feeney. Welcome back to Socially Democratic.
I feel like you're using my own jokes against me now. A pleasure to be back. Lucky I was available at the last moment. But as you know, I'm usually available to go to the opening of an envelope, so here I am.
Indeed you are. You're a mainstay over the last 200 episodes. We do appreciate your contribution. So I want to talk to you about federal politics. It's been over 12 months now since the Albanese government were elected, which was a great night for the Australian Labor Party. I want to get your reflections on how the government's gone in the first 12 months since May last year. What's been its strengths?
Well, I've really enjoyed watching the Labor government over the last 12 months. I think they're doing really well. And one of the sort of mainstays of that success, I think, is the fact that there's really just a lot of talent in the government, and the Prime Minister has organised that talent in such a way as it's really working hard and succeeding. So I guess what I mean by that is that you see every day really that the jobs in the government, large and small, ministries large and small, ministers important and less important, are all given the opportunity to develop themselves and their own ideas for the portfolio and then speak to that in the public domain. And I think a lot of journalists are enjoying the fact that they now get various ministers, large and small, unplugged in their own areas of responsibility. And we see, from the Prime Minister and the Treasurer and key ministers down all the way to assistant ministers, that there's that sort of engagement. And it gives, I think it speaks to the fact that the Prime Minister doesn't feel the need to dominate the messaging and the imagery of the whole show, but in fact feels free and indeed feels that it's a strength of his government that he can give ministers that opportunity. And I think it's a little reminiscent of the Hawke government, where government by cabinet, but ministers had the freedom to build their own personas and promote their own issues. And it's, as it did then, it is now, I think, giving the government a real sense of depth in the public imagination. I think it also has the sort of collateral effect of occupying a lot of the media window with Labor voices and Labor thoughts. And it means that the government is starting to be populated by figures who are, growing in the public imagination, people who've always been important to the show. We insiders understand that, but they are now more public figures, and that's been really healthy. So enjoying that very much. And you see, really by contrast, the Liberal opposition really has struggled to get out past the big man, but from out and under Dunn, there's not really a sense that that's a show that has got lots of talent or other significant figures in it. Or when people complain about Dutton's leadership or suggest that he might not lead them to the next election, and you counterpose, well, who next? There's a deafening silence, because there's no sense that there's a lot of people in the Federal Parliamentary Liberal Party who are making that organisation interesting. Whereas even in the darkest days of the 80s, it was, is it going to be Peacock or is it going to be Howard? There was at least two of them. So I feel like the government's doing really well in that sense. And then in terms of the issues themselves, I think they've struck a really good balance between reform and continuity. And the budget perhaps exemplifies that, where there was building the Labor government's economic credentials, but nonetheless implementing a lot of Labor programs and pressing ahead with Labor reform. There's obviously, nothing's perfect. The stage 3 tax reforms continue to be an issue out there on the horizon. But again, I think that's an interesting example where the Prime Minister is just letting that roll out and fester. And perhaps with a view to letting that issue resolve in a way that he likes. I guess we'll see how that story ends. But the voice is obviously an issue, and I guess we'll come to that, which I think had a whole lot of challenges.
Okay, so just picking up on that first point, when you talked about, I guess, the cohesiveness of the Albanese government and how ministers have been given some room to express themselves and do good work. Anthony Albanese was a minister in the last government, which was the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government, and you were a member of that parliament. Do you think that has Albo always been like that as a leader, or has he learnt some of the lessons from certainly the Rudd leadership in the way that he conducted the government, that Anthony's sort of said, oh, well, we need to learn from this, we need to do it differently?
Well, Anthony Albanese said consistently that he wanted to have a government by cabinet, but he's not the first to have said that. He's just the first to have done that in a long time. I think Julia Gillard made a similar declaration, but I think, frankly, it became impossible for her because the cabinet was riddled with so many who were determined to leak and bring down her government. Anthony doesn't have that problem. He's got a loyal cabinet, and I think that loyalty is buttressed and nurtured by the fact that he's managing the cabinet in the way that he is. As to how he came to understand this, I think his experience in the Rudd-Gillard period obviously was very formative, but also remember apparatchik and activist throughout that Hawke Keating period as well, and he saw that too. So he's seen what success looks like, and he's seen what failure looks like up close, and he seems to have learned some pretty important lessons, and is now in a position where he's putting them into effect. And a leader has to be comfortable in their own skin if they're going to run a cabinet in the way he's running it, and he is. He's confident of his support and loyalty inside the caucus. He doesn't have those anxieties which sometimes bedevil a leader. That's not an issue here. Senior ministers are loyal. They're all working collectively and collegiately together. So the recipe's right, the time is right, and we're watching it work really well. And when it works really well, we see that it doesn't diminish the leader. The leader might not be on television 7 nights a week, but they might only be 2 or 3 or 4. But that's a healthy thing for the government, and it's actually a healthy thing for the longevity and life of a leader too. So I think all of those factors are working well.
Margaret Simons, who writes for The Guardian, spoke at a Writers' Festival event a couple of weeks ago. I wasn't there, but someone had sort of told me about her remarks about what she perceives as what's going on with this particular government and their long-term planning. And she views that this first term really is just trying to establish the economic credentials of this Labor government with the voting public, that they're a safe pair of hands, that they're trying to return a government to some level of normality after the insanity of particularly the Morrison years, and not to do anything too drastic in terms of reform, and that they want to then win a second term, and then it's in the second term that we then start to see what we refer to as a traditional Labor reforming type government. Is that something that you would agree with, or do you see something different?
No, I'd agree with that, and I think context is everything. Let's remember the last federal election, how this government came to be. It was a small target strategy, which meant that the Labor Party adopted a whole lot of positions that it wasn't excited about. Stage 3 tax cuts, strings to mind. And we now have all of these progressives in the media and elsewhere whinging about the fact that Labor is doing X or Labor is doing Y. But of course, that's because Labor is keeping its promises, even when those promises were unwelcome promises. But I think the Prime Minister is determined to not fall into the trap of breaking a promise, and hasn't lost sight of the fact that, as charming as The Guardian or the ABC is, there's a gorilla out there called News Corp, and it's busting to jump on this government and attack it. And that gorilla is, the reason stage 3 tax cuts were not opposed by the Labor Party at the last federal election, because the Labor Party didn't fall into the trap set for it of, allowing Morrison and News Corp to brand it as a high taxing party and a party of increasing taxes. So in avoiding some of those obvious traps, the Labor Party has adopted positions that it will now not retreat from, because it now doesn't want to be accused of being a government that breaks faith with the electorate and with its own election promises. And that frustrates people, several commentators and characters of the left and far left, but they lose sight of the reason why the Labor Party got to where it is, which is by adopting those stratagems in order to win an election, and now not falling into obvious pits that are dug for it by News Corp and others. So, we see that unfold from time to time in various issues, but I think it speaks to your point, which is that the government is about building the foundation stones for a long-term Labor government, and not just going for the sugar hit of cheap and easy reform policy now, which can be accused of either putting the budget at risk or breaking faith with the electorate and breaking promises.
With your campaign hat on and looking at the way that the Voice to Parliament referendum campaign has played out, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that. I was on Raf Epstein on his Drive program last Thursday night, and he asked me a question about this And I kind of put a question back to him as well, because he was just talking about, how's it going and how's it playing out and whatnot. And I said to him, I was surprised that, in the summer of this year, 2023, when most people are either on holiday or at the cricket or watching tennis, that this issue just sort of started to appear in the mainstream media. And he said to me that he thought that it was the Tories or the Conservatives or those that wanted to run the No campaign were running it out now and getting on the attack early. And in my mind, I sort of thought, I found a lot of Labor MPs talking about voice early in that summer period. And I wondered why we sort of were kicking off talking about this referendum, when I kind of felt that folks that wanted to actually lead and run the program hadn't actually run the Yes campaign, probably hadn't even sat down and actually started to work out what the strategy would look like. And then all of a sudden we're now talking about this referendum that we didn't have a question, we didn't have a date, there was a lot of things that even basic fundamentals, logistics hadn't been laid down, yet now we're talking about it. And I just sort of wonder, if you had your time again, would you want to be talking about it in January? How do you see this campaign? What have you observed so far, and where do you think it's heading?
Well, I've felt very bleak about this almost from the beginning, unfortunately, and I have shared some of those thoughts and insights with my former colleagues. The Prime Minister really elevated this issue in his election night victory speech. And I think that brought this issue to centre stage in a way that none of us had realised it was going to occupy centre stage for this first-term government. But I think what we saw very quickly thereafter was that this kind of summer of love that set in on the sort of centre-left side of the couch, where there was a new Labor government, kumbaya, everyone was talking about the voice and recognition, kumbaya, and it all kind of just drifted away in a daze of self-congratulation. And there was something of an air at that time that this was a bit of a fait accompli, that there were big majorities in favour of it. Opinion elites, corporate elites, political elites were all kind of supportive of it, and it was set to roll through in this kind of summer of love that at the end of last year. But it was very clear to me very quickly that this summer of love wasn't penetrating the cold, dark heart of the Conservatives. And there were a few things that set me alive to this. There were, and I think really Peter Credlin and Brian Loughnane can get the credit for this. I came to understand that they were playing a key role in assessing the Liberal Party's last federal election efforts and how the Leader of the Opposition's office was being established. And at the same time as they were doing this kind of foundational work around Dutton and the Federal Liberal Party, Peter Credlin was using her Sky and News Limited soapboxes to sort of set out, to articulate why the voice was a bad idea. And that they didn't have enough form, that there were questions that weren't answered, that how's it going to work, the questions of detail that are problematic for the voice advocates. Who's going to be on the roll? How's the role going to be maintained? How are you going to prove the Aboriginality of voters? How many people are getting elected? What does an elected office look like? Who's running the regions? Who's conducting the distributions? Blah, blah, questions of detail that are problematic, and which were fertile fields for Peter Credlin and News Limited in those early days. But it was largely passed unnoticed because, we were coming up to the Victorian election, and the Victorian Liberals, at that point, there were lots of Liberal voices that seemed to be positioning towards a yes. And there was a lot of optimism in the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party, and I'm sure they deny this now, that the Liberal Party was going to ultimately fold into a yes, and that this summer of love was going to sweep the board. I warned a number of my former colleagues that the Liberal Party was not going to fold into this summer of love and ultimately move to a yes position. It was going to move to a no position, and it would do that in the aftermath of the Victorian and New South Wales state elections. Peter Dutton wasn't going to give those state Liberal parties the interference or the alibi of him adopting a no position while they were still in the hustings. But very soon after New South Wales, we saw them move to a no. And in the interregnum, prior to them moving to a hard no, they did play a dance. Oh, we're thinking about it. We're meeting with stakeholders. We're asking the Labor Party for more detail. They played a dance, which left a lot of people more hopeful than they should have been. But I think, for me, it's always been clear they were going to move to a no. And, the Australian was putting Lydia Thorpe on its front page in the middle of 2022 for a reason. And that's because even before she left the Greens, she was proving to be, a moving problem for the Yes case and the Voice. And of course, now that she's moved to the crossbenches as an independent, that's only more so. And it was clear, I think, that, with Senator Price from the Northern Territory, with Senator Thorpe becoming an independent, leading what she describes as the progressive nose, that there is a coalition of black faces that will be able to be used by the coalition to say, if the Indigenous peoples of this country can't agree on it, why should we? And that will play, unfortunately, and I think tragically, that will play very easily into a Conservative campaign to say, if they can't agree, let's vote no. If they don't know what it's about, why are we voting yes? I think there's, I think characters like Warren Mundine and Lydia Thorpe and Senator Price will be significant factors in giving a whole lot of people an excuse to vote no.
They almost feel like they're, without them, they're very similar to the sort of Phil Cleary spoiler campaign that was run by during the 1999 Australian Republic referendum, in which there were Republicans who were out there saying vote no.
Yeah, and and the Yes case does not really seem to have got past its summer of love phase, and hardened up to the fact that its adversaries are ponying up for a cold-blooded fight. Now, so that makes me very bleak about the campaign and very bleak about the prospects of a yes vote, to be honest. And that makes me think, well, what are the implications of that for the government, which, like you, I care about? And I think, so what does the Albanese government look like the day after a no? Well, it'll have lost a layer of skin, but it's not a fatal blow. Albo will have still presided over a cause which was virtuous and will be seen to be such as it goes further and further into the rearview mirror. Dutton and the Liberal Party will be, the forces of darkness that killed something that should have been allowed to go forward. So that victory will not be an ornament for the Liberal Party. It'll be a cross for them to carry. And the government, in large part because of how it manages itself and its cabinet, still has a lot to talk about and a lot of accomplishments to work on going forward. So I don't think it's a fatal blow for the Albanese government, but it is in its own right a tragic development that I think we're heading towards. And that is, such a modest proposal from our First Peoples is going to, I think, fail because of divisions inside, or perceived divisions inside First Peoples' voices in the public domain, and a lot of confusion and a complacent, dare I say it, a complacent yes campaign.
If you were advising the campaign, the Yes campaign, what would be one or two nuggets, I wouldn't say nuggets of wisdom, but where would you start in terms of trying to turn the ship around?
Well, I think the smallness of the proposal, how this is something that's of great significance, but is not going to transform how we are governed. It needs to be emphasised. I think Indigenous faces and voices, they've got to absolutely avoid the trap that the Republican campaign fell into, which is becoming the darling of the chattering classes as a campaign and dying in the streets of our cities as a consequence. This has to be a far more mainstream campaign, which is targeting the suburbs and suburban voters, those voters who will be most vulnerable to a message which is, it's not broken, don't fix it. Aboriginal Australia can't agree on this, so why should you? How's this? This thing going to be a giant boondoggle, just as ATSIC was in years gone by. Those are the critiques that the Yes campaign has to prepare itself to blunt and defeat. And I just don't see any sign that it is. And there are, because, Dutton used the line for month after month, we need more detail, we need more detail. We've kind of become instinctively resistant to providing more detail, but there is an issue there. How does it work and what's it going to do? There does need to be some answers to those questions, not because Joe Average is interested, but Joe Average is interested in making sure that somebody has checked that box. And if Joe Average can be told that no one's allowed to see what's under the hood, he just isn't going to buy the car.
Yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? The sort of sources from inside the camps, the supporting forces for the Yes campaign are telling us that the research isn't as bleak as it says that in the published polls, but you can't not deny that it certainly. And I want to believe them on that, but it's just the trends. Like they had a 65, 70% approval rating, 6, 7, 8 months ago, and now it's sort of.
Well, in the summer of love, they thought the whole thing was going to get up by acclamation, with the fantasy that Dutton was going to embrace it. Here we are in the middle of 2023, and there's a pretty deadly coalition in existence. That is a deadly coalition of interests that are opposed to it, which includes some prominent Aboriginal faces, and if they're not prominent, News Limited will make sure they become prominent, and the coalition itself, who are, I think, entranced by the idea that if they can defeat Labor at this, it will set the stage for them to have some kind of resurgence at the next federal election. As I explained, I don't think it will, but I think that's the what they're chasing.
I mean, their stocks are so low right now. I mean, they just need a jag or win somewhere. They're 0 from 5 in the last set of elections that we've had, both at state, national, and even by-elections, for God's sake. I mean, they lost Aston. I mean, they completely kicked them in the ball. So, yeah, you're right. I think they're just looking for any kind of positivity from the electorate in terms of taking a position on something. Well, this is going to be a campaign that will continue to play out over the next couple of months, and ideally we'd like to have you back on the show, David, to continue to talk about that. But once again, thank you for your time coming on. I know it's a very short interview, but thanks for coming on to today's show, and thanks for supporting the podcast with your insights over the last 200 episodes. We do appreciate your time today.
My pleasure, and can I congratulate you and the team for the initiative and putting this together, and for building it in such a way as it's been sustainable over 200 shows and many more 100 to go. It fills an important space in the national conversation.
Cheers. Okay, we're going to finish off our celebratory 200th episode with our final guest, saving the best for last. She's a regular, I guess I don't want to call her a regular Washington, D.C. US politics correspondent, but I feel like she's been on the show enough now to earn that title. But she's more than that, because she's a Democratic strategist in the United States, and a successful one at that, because she was the state director that ran the Georgia runoffs, which was no small thing, because that just delivered the Senate for the Democrats a long time ago at a crucial moment in US politics. But we all know her as Jonae Wartel. Welcome back to Socially Democratic.
It is an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And congratulations on 200 episodes. Incredible.
I was joking with one of the other guests before. Not even the OC managed to do 200 episodes. So I feel like it's an achievement.
Well, now they're doing the reboot where they're going through all the episodes and actually doing the commentary now on that new podcast. So maybe you should do that. You should just do a director and a host cut of all your episodes once you've reached the milestone.
Can I tell you, Jonae, that this is one of my secret shames? I watched that podcast.
You do, with Kristen Cavallari and Steven?
Yeah.
Okay, so follow her on Instagram, and I weirdly know so much about her life. It's a little shameful. I almost bought that cookbook she put out. Don't tell anyone.
I didn't know that she did a cookbook. Okay, radio.
She did.
It's one of those things where YouTube and the algorithm, I just happened to click on one of them out of interest. Just
Yes.
one.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden it started popping up my feed. Oh, I'll watch that one as well.
The algorithm never fails. It'll always get you. It exposes your dirty secrets. Like if we were all just to sit and look at folks' Instagram feeds of all the random explore pages, it would tell us a lot about people that they would probably never want us to know.
I know. Anyway,
well.
we get to it is who we are, isn't it?
Now, so here we are exposed.
So I want to talk to you. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I want to talk to you about obviously US politics, but in particular, I thought we could divide the show up into two parts: the red part and then the blue part. I don't know. Do you want to do Republicans first or Democrats first?
Let's do Republicans first.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
The primary is just too interesting and too crazy so far to not dive into. It's delicious, dare I say.
My first question to you on the primary is, I feel like that this is 2016 all over again. I think one of the reasons why Trump was successful in the primary and caught everyone by surprise was because it was such in Australia, we'd call it a Melbourne Cup field. There's a lot of horses in this race. And Trump managed all the moderates seem to be splitting their vote, and Trump just ran through the middle, right? This time around, it looks like it's happening again. Every 20 minutes, every time I open up the New York Times, someone else is nominated. Is this going to help Trump again?
I think so. I do think that a divided Republican primary field does benefit Donald Trump. He has been for the past few years since leaving office, he's shown that he still really has a stranglehold on the Republican brand, right? And despite the indictment, despite everything we've learned about him since leaving office, we find that Republican voters still like him, right? It's a really tough nut to crack. And I think that Republican strategists, the Republican primary candidates have to figure out how to create a messaging strategy that helps to bring voters back from the Donald Trump camp and really adopt a new path, a new brand for the Republican Party. I think it's going to be a super hard thing to do. I don't think that the lack of progress in the House that they currently have control of is helping their brand at all. You still have folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, really still front and center running the caucus. Lauren Boebert, you still have people right now who are showing what the Republican brand truly looks like. And the majority of Republican voters are still saying, that's okay with me. That's fine with me. So I think until there is really an appetite to adopt a more moderate, centrist brand of the Republican Party, they're really in trouble. And so I'm interested to see how this plays out as more folks get into the race, who are more moderate and even more extreme, especially as we head into the first primary race of the season. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
So if you're a moderate Republican and you're nominated for the presidency as the nominee, Chris Christie, for example, like, what is he doing? He's polling at less than 2%. I mean, what's the point of this, right?
Truly, I don't see the point, and I don't remember Chris Christie doing well in 2016 either. He is, despite being an elected Republican governor in a blue state, he just doesn't have that range of appeal that you would expect someone with that electoral history to have. And I will credit him as being one of the few people to really talk tough at Donald Trump. But frankly, he was a little too soft on him in the earlier days in 2016, right? And so it's kind of like it's a little too late now to be playing tough on Donald Trump. I do think that he does appeal to a faction of the Republican Party that says, hey, enough. We need responsible leadership. We need experienced leadership. But I do think that that they still haven't reclaimed the brand. And so someone like him, though probably the most sensical of all of the choices, still can't break through the noise. And so I think that he's just taking up time, taking up resources, taking up space in the primary field where they really should be focusing on consolidating behind the most viable alternative and seeing how can they bring Republicans out of the Trump camp and consolidate behind a reasonable choice for president. And I'm truly puzzled on why they haven't done that or why that wasn't the approach going into this primary season. But, it's really playing out worse than I'd expected.
Who is that candidate then, do you think, that the non-Trump element can coalesce around? Is it Mike Pence? Is it DeSantis? Like, who is that candidate? Nikki Haley?
I want to be clear that the entire field of Republican candidates is pretty dangerous, right? You've got Ron DeSantis, who has passed some of the most harmful legislation, has signed some of the most harmful bills into law in the state of Florida. He is wreaking havoc on the LGBTQ and ethnic minority populations in the state. I think he'd be a dangerous leader. Despite that, I think he, based on polling, is the closest to Trump, right? So if you want to say, who is the most likely to be able to take him on? Well, logically, it's probably the person that's next in line in terms of polling, right? So while I think he's a dangerous choice, certainly he's probably a little bit more capable and I would say like maniacal in that way, because when folks understand kind of the ethos of the voter, they're almost more dangerous than when they're kind of irresponsible and reckless like Donald Trump. I think that they're that much more dangerous, but I think that given how much better he's polling than pretty much everyone else in the field, Mike Pence, Nikki Haley, I think he's probably got the best chance.
If, and to your point, they're all shit candidates, and obviously this is a left-wing podcast, so we're not gonna. But in some crazy world, Jonae, where you had to give advice to one of these non-Trump candidates, how would you handle the ongoing legal challenges that former President Donald Trump is experiencing? How would you tell your candidate to address that? How would you frame that? Would you ignore it, or would you go after him? Is this an opportunity, or is it something you just don't touch?
I think you got to go after it. I think you have to make clear that Donald Trump as president is a dangerous choice. Trump's closest advisors have even said that. His former cabinet secretaries have said that. So I do think that the Republican field across the board needs to be, their number one messaging point needs to be, this is a dangerous choice for president. And I think you have a couple of folks who are saying that, the Chris Christies of the world, but you don't have enough of those candidates saying it because a lot of them are still afraid of him, right? You need Kevin McCarthy saying that Trump is a dangerous candidate, but his own caucus has him in a stranglehold, and so he's never going to say that, right? So you need that to be the unequivocal stance of the party that he's a dangerous candidate. I don't think they should let up there. I think they need to really demonstrate and reinforce what a threat he is. I think beyond that, though, I think you've really got to take Biden to task on the things that he hasn't done yet, right? I think you've got to say, we've made some progress. It's not enough progress, that that inflation is still ravaging the economy despite the job growth numbers. I think you've got to say, this is something, but it's not enough, right? I can deliver more. I can deliver better. And I think you'd have a fair argument, because as wonderful as Biden has done, we can all agree that there's more work to be done. And so if you're going to attack him on anything, it's saying, I can do more, I can do better. The country is not made enough progress. So if I'm a strategist, if I'm advising one of the candidates, that's where I'm digging in.
Well, thankfully you're not advising one of those candidates, and you are on the good team. So let's talk about the good. You'll need to have a shower after that question. Let's talk about the good team, shall we? And you talked about President Biden. Reading all the major papers in the United States in the last couple of weeks, there's really good numbers coming out in terms of the US economy. Inflation has halved. It's not back to where it was, pre-pandemic, but it is low now. Like I think it's 4%, down from like I got it as high as 9 or 10, I think it was. Job numbers are great. The economy is growing again. Things are on the up. Yet those numbers aren't translating into the president's own job approval rating. What's going on there?
Well, I think that that point speaks to, I think, a broader messaging challenge that Democrats have long had. This is not the first cycle; it's been a challenge, which is that we don't effectively talk about our accomplishments. We don't effectively talk about the things that we have done. And I think that the administration and the Democratic Party have done a better job in this administration with talking about the accomplishments of the president, touting job growth numbers, touting historic legislation on climate, touting the great things that the president has been able to keep his promises on, the promises he made on the campaign trail. So I think that the winning strategy is to be much more aggressive about messaging those accomplishments. Yes, he still has to govern. Yes, he's still got another 2 years of making sure that he's advancing his agenda in ways that are going to, put points on the board for Democrats. But we need a more aggressive messaging strategy. We need to be on the airwaves, on radio. We need to be on TV. We need to be in rural America. We need to be at town halls. We need to be in these communities that we've taken for granted and helping them to understand what the president has done and how it has benefited those communities. I think we also got to listen, right? Because there are people who will say, well, President Biden, hasn't been able to make, progress on things like voting rights and other freedoms that are under attack. And you can look at what's going on the national stage, particularly with attacks on reproductive health. And, they'll look at, things that are still challenges right now politically and say, well, there's so much more that the president can do. And I think it's important to listen and say, yes, there's more that we can do, but the president is leading us in the right direction. He's making progress on key issues. And so I do think that a more aggressive messaging of the president's accomplishments will, one, help continue to drive up those approval numbers, but also reach voters who are the most important part of this entire conversation and make sure that they understand and that they are standing with the president. And I think that's something we need to already be doing now. Let's not wait until 2024. Let's start having those conversations now in 2023. So when we get there, there's already an echo chamber, not just nationally, but in the states.
How difficult is it to create legislative change or try and run that agenda when you don't have control of the House of Representatives?
Well, I think we have to be reminded, and I'm sure, Republicans will remind us that, we did have control of those chambers in the first part of, the president's term. And we were able to pass some historic legislation, but we did not. There were things that we were not able to get done on voting rights, for example. And so I do think, we need to remind the American people that we were able to get a lot done, right? That in any government, you're not going to be able to get every single thing done in a short period of time, but that we've made significant progress. But I do think now is a great moment to message the fact that we were able to make such progress in the previous Congress, and now look at where we're stalling out. It's kind of the perfect moment, frankly, right? Because all of the lack of progress over the last 2 years, you could actually point to a Congress that hasn't been super cooperative, right? That's been obstructionist, that has been just making a mockery in some ways of our democratic process, and they haven't been putting American issues first. And so I think that, we all have to take the responsibility, obviously, for what Democratic members are doing. How are they advancing legislation? How are they voting? But also remember, we don't have control of that chamber, right? And what we can do in the Senate is, with the seats that we have is great, but we have a bicameral, we have a House and a Senate. And so, progress rests on the shoulders of those two chambers. And so I do think it's a great moment to message particularly the progress we were able to make when he first took office, but then also point to, if you don't feel in this moment that we're doing enough, then be reminded we're not actually fully in charge anymore. Look at the difference, right? And so I think it's a good contrasting point.
Whilst the Republicans go through their primary season and rip themselves apart, hopefully, what should the Democrats be doing in this time? Because obviously there won't be a primary. We touch wood that the president won't be primaried, so they've got clear air from a campaign strategist perspective. Even if you take it down to a House member in a battleground district, what should they be doing between now and sort of when we sort of move into the election season in sort of mid 2024?
Well, I think we need to start with a cohesive message, right? What are the key accomplishments that we are touting, right? In every corner of the country, in every state, we should have organizers, we should have folks on the ground who are able to talk to voters very early on and about the president's accomplishments, what he's been able to do, how he's worked on behalf of the American people. We don't just need to be, giving press conferences and saying, look at the president's accomplishments, or just, sending a media release or just doing an interview on cable news. We need to be in communities talking about this, right? Because you're talking about a race that's going to come down to close margins in places like Michigan, in places like Pennsylvania, in those keys in places like Wisconsin. So you're talking about close margins, and what do we need to overcome close margins, or to make sure that close margins work in our favor and not the Republicans' favor? Organizing. And so I think that that's going to be the key to success this cycle. I think that if we're starting early with those conversations, we're not trying to microwave engagement with key communities, particularly communities of color, that we do traditionally have challenges with having a longer runway of outreach. We need to make sure that we're doing that very early. And so I think those two things, on top of cohesive messaging, will be foundational and certainly a big part of the recipe for success in 2024.
And I was just thinking through, going back through all the different election cycles, this is a rare moment really for the Democratic Party. The last time that we were in a situation like this was going to the 2012 presidential for Obama's second term, in which the party has got time to build that infrastructure at a grassroots level. And I think you were an organizer back then. What lessons do we take from that experience, that what the Obama campaign did, both the successes but also the challenges that you would then heed to campaigners getting ready for this election cycle in 2024?
Well, I think that one thing that was important to draw from in terms of lessons from, the second Obama campaign, was that organizing was still king, right? It was still the most central and well-funded part of their strategy. And I think that that's important because, we didn't look and say, here's a president that's running for re-election. He's pretty popular, Mitt Romney, he's not likable enough. We didn't take voters for granted. They put as much resources into organizing as they did in 2008, and in some ways even at a higher scale. And so I think that that's a really important lesson that we can take from the 2012 election. We built and organized in every precinct across the states. We didn't just focus in the urban areas. We went out to rural areas. I was in an urban area in 2012, but I was in a more rural area in 2008. And I knew that I had to organize and engage volunteers and build teams to work in person to turn out the vote. And so I think that that's the biggest lesson that we can take, is not taking any voters for granted and organizing. And so I think, another piece of this that's important to, to recognize is that 2020 was a very unique year in organizing, where we didn't have as much in-person infrastructure that was put into place. We didn't have as much door knocking in the general election, and thank God that we were able to win despite not having as much of an in-person robust field force. But it also means that fast forward to 2024, a lot of that recent infrastructure is not there for us to just turn back on, right? And so we've got to relay some foundations in communities, because they've changed a lot over the last 8 years, to make sure that that we're not taking for granted any voter who could make the difference in any of these key states.
Well, it's going to be a fascinating campaign, and one that we're going to be watching with close quarters and through the eyes of your good self, as always, Jonae. And on a personal note, can I say thank you very much for the support that you've given the podcast over the years. I've loved your conversations, and obviously, you play a great role in our US delegation, the Australian delegation. We take over to Washington and New York every September, because we have a session with you as well, which we love dearly. But just from the bottom of my heart, from Australia across the ocean, thank you very much for the support you've given to the podcast, and we look forward to seeing you this September as well.
Wonderful. It's been a joy to join these conversations. Thank you for engaging and allowing me to share some insights. And it's always been a pleasure to see the delegation when you all come stateside. So I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button, and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Today's episode of Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians, and they've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means that you'll get the best results possible. To find out more, go to their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.